Hi and good day. Welcome to another episode of All of the Day. You may notice format's a little different. This is our first episode without Derek, so it's myself, Setzer, and
It's me, Chesten, Derek's
welcome
brother.
back. Today we
Thanks.
have a special format episode. There wasn't a whole lot of news this week, and we've both had some life events that have kind of kept us away from video games. So we thought we'd do Christmas in July special. We thought it'd be interesting to take a look at the ways we've enjoyed playing games with other people over the years and how that experience has changed as we've grown older and our lives have changed, not to mention how much the technology surrounding that has evolved. Cheston, you're only a year older than I am, so we're right in the same age group. But I think, the way we played games growing up was pretty different.
I mean, it bears little to no resemblance to what I see people growing up now, people growing up in the age of smartphones and other mobile devices and constant access to games. It doesn't reflect my childhood almost at all.
So what would you say was the quintessential childhood multiplayer experience for you?
Quintessential multiplayer experience for us, because I grew up with a brother, Derek. And we have another brother, but he's several years younger. So for most of my childhood, it was just Derek and I.
Hmm.
And for us, the quintessential multiplayer experience was, well, it was really me watching him play Final Fantasy. I actually had to confer with Derek before this because I was thinking, you know, when I was trying to remember our multiplayer experience as kids, a lot of our time gaming was me watching you play all the Final Fantasies, or you watching me play Banjo-Kazooie or whatever, Nintendo baby game was out at the time. But that said, I think when we did play multiplayer, it was a lot of fighting games. So when I think quintessential multiplayer, I think a traditional two-player fighter game, or fighting game, rather, with Derek as player one because he demanded to be player one at all times, and I was the lowly player two, and we would play several rounds and see how many times Derek could wipe the floor with me before I just got sick of it. How about you?
Yeah, so I'm the oldest of all my siblings. I have four siblings, and they're all much younger than I am. So they were not really interested in video games. By the time my little brother was old enough to start playing games, he's much younger than I am. So he has very divergent tastes, as I think we'll touch on later. So my quintessential multiplayer growing up was playing Halo with my dad. I talked about that a few
Mm.
weeks ago, and because that was like the only legitimate multiplayer game when I was a kid, I actually had a lot more single player games that I would bring to my friend's place, or when they came to visit. We would kind of trade off, do that.
Hmm.
Funny enough, a lot of my friends were in the same boat where they didn't have a lot of multiplayer games, so we had this like pooled library of single player games that we would just kind of sit around and watch each other play. I think that all changed though, and I know you can relate to this with World of Warcraft back in
Mm. Yes.
2004, 2005.
Yeah. That was a sea change for sure.
Yeah, yeah, I was in sixth grade when I started playing WoW. I want to say back in
I
vanilla.
I think that's right. Well, yeah, I think you had been playing because that was actually how our first ever conversations as people were about World of
Yeah,
Warcraft because I had two friends that knew you and another mutual friend of ours were into World of Warcraft, and occasionally our lunch table that we usually sat at would fill up and we would navigate over to yours and we would trade barbs back and forth about you filthy gnome players.
yeah, yeah. That was before we really started hanging out. That was before we were
Oh,
really
absolutely.
friends.
Yeah.
You were
Yeah,
the
that
imposing junior high student, and
Oh
I was
man,
still a mere elementary schooler.
I think that's the only time in recorded history that I've been referred to as imposing. So I'll absolutely take it.
You're
Yeah,
welcome.
World of Warcraft was interesting because you were talking about you and your friends having a shared pool of multiplayer games. And
Single
that
player
was one of the,
games.
oh, single player games, sorry. But one of the things that occurred to me when we were planning out this topic, and like I said, my experience was watching Derek play games and him watching me play games. It wasn't a lot of multiplayer games. But when I thought about it, there weren't, before online gaming became what it is now, there weren't really that many games that were what I would consider multiplayer experiences primarily. Like there were a lot of games back then that like tacked it on the back end, but you were dedicated, this is a multiplayer game. Like that was, in my hindsight at least, kind of few and far between. I mean, I think the Nintendo 64 had plenty of experiences like that, but if you think about before that, the Super Nintendo, or maybe lateral to that, the PlayStation, possibly because of hardware limitations with the two controller ports, by default, it was something where I just felt like there really weren't that many options, anyways, until you had games like World of Warcraft that took advantage of our great connected future.
See, it's funny you say that because that is definitely not the case for PC. PC had a
True.
lot of major
Yeah,
multiplayer titles back in the day. I never got to play most of them. They were all violent, gory shooters. But yeah, games like Quake, Counter Strike, Half Life,
you're
those
right.
had pretty
Yeah,
illustrious multiplayer careers. They were kind of a major departure from what you were seeing on console at the time. I mean, back then, PCs had modems and consoles didn't, to put it into
right.
perspective, right?
And that was a huge difference. Like, yeah, because we did not. Our computer was back in back in those times. A lot of times the computer was just like an appliance, like an oven,
Hmm.
and your parents had it, and they had it off to the corner, and maybe you used it once a week to like print something or check your email. But I never viewed it as a gaming device, and Derek eventually turned it into one in some regards. He got into Starcraft shortly after that, became such a huge phenomenon, and
Hmm.
he dabbled in some emulators back in the day that made it a little more of a gaming device. But like we had no context for Quake or Half-Life or Team Fortress or Counter-Strike or these games where people were already taking advantage of the internet to connect with people across the world. Our connection to multiplayer was purely when we would play fighting games, when we would play Smash Brothers, or when Derek's friends would come over, or my friends would come over and we'd play GoldenEye or Perfect Dark. And for us, that was the world of multiplayer games, and it did not exist elsewhere. But yeah, we have that blind spot with the PC.
Yeah, I mean, my dad was really into building PCs back in the day, so I definitely got a lot more exposure to that. I mentioned Halo earlier, and that's really the only legitimately multiplayer console game I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, it was certainly like the first one where I remember it being like an event. Like, Mario Party, if you had friends over, oh, there happened to be here, let's play some Mario Party, let's play some Smash Brothers. But people were intentionally going out of their way. Like Derek of all people went to Halo LAN parties. Like it was a huge sea change. Now, that said, another game that was kind of like that for him, I know. So Halo wasn't the only one, but Derek's one of the only people in the world I know, one of two people who's ever used a PlayStation multitap. And him and his friends used to get together for Time Splitters 2 parties. And I don't remember if those were LAN parties or not, but that was kind of around the same time as Halo. So definitely Halo in that era started to change things.
I mean, yeah, we're already kind of talking about stuff like World of Warcraft, stuff like Halo, which, is the champion of Xbox Live, right? When you think Xbox Live, everybody thinks Halo. We're already kind of talking about how games and technology around multiplayer changed as we grew up. We really were right on that cusp.
Yeah, I mean, the Dreamcast was the first system I remember connecting to the internet, and that I remember at least, and that was 1999. Once that technology was out there, I remember when you first started to hear about it, like with games like Phantasy Star Online.
Hmm.
And for me as a console player, it was like, what the hell are you talking about? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm gonna connect with three people across the globe we're gonna hang out in like this lobby and then we're gonna go kill monsters together. It seemed like it was something that only people in
Mhm.
make believe could possibly do or afford.
Yeah, I mean, I actually knew a guy with a Dreamcast. One of my school buddies, he had one, and I remember going to his house and being like so blown away that he had this thing that connected to the internet, right? This like game console that could connect to the internet like a PC. So I was like, man, let's fire this thing up. Like let's do some, what was it, like Sega Channel or something?
Yeah, I don't know. Their Sega Channel, I believe, was something totally different. I don't remember what they called their online connective service
Yeah.
other than Black Magic.
But I remember he was like, "Oh, we can't do that. My dad doesn't want to pay for it." And so the first time like I actually brought a console online was Halo 2. I remember being like so fascinated by the like 10-second voice clips people would send you after a match and just stuff like that. And then I remember being like so engrossed by that and last episode I kind of mentioned having bought Fantasy Star Online episodes 1 and 2. I had those on GameCube, not Xbox.
As did I, yes.
And I remember being totally mystified by the idea of like buying a modem that slots into the bottom of the GameCube and getting that
Well,
GameCube keyboard controller. Did you see that thing?
the thing that was like 3 football fields wide.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I remember
yeah.
like I remember thinking like distinctly, why can't this just work like the Xbox? Like why does it have to be this way?
And that's a great question. That
I mean,
that
that's
device,
Nintendo.
that is Nintendo's, leitmotif. And I remember playing that game and having that same memory about thinking like, I, I wonder if I can buy that modem or that router, that slots in the bottom of the GameCube and connects to my internet. But it was like I don't remember ever seeing one in person.
Mhm.
I certainly didn't know anybody who had one.
Mhm.
Like that, of all things, seemed like something that nobody could possibly have. And I think that bared out to be true because I don't think that was a very successful adapter or accessory for the GameCube.
Of my friends at the time, I think I was the only one to actually have a GameCube in the first place, and I had never ever like heard of the modem adapter until I specifically sought it out for Fantasy Star, and I never even came close to asking to buy one.
Well, I don't know if your experience was different at the time, but it just seemed like such an inconvenience and a hassle because already to play a game online, at least in my household, this was pre-Wi-Fi, and for whatever reason, because I was at the mercy of my parents, we had the one Ethernet cord.
Mhm.
So it was like we had to choose between the computer being connected or the game system being connected. So like adding on that layer on top of it, okay, I'm gonna buy this accessory, which I probably was $100 or something,
Yeah,
impossible to find, and then when I get it, I'm gonna be able to use it like what, once a week because that's the only time my parents are gonna be like, all right, fine, take the Ethernet cable out of the computer. We don't need internet right now. You just plug it into your GameCube and go crazy, go ham on Fantasy Star Online.
yeah, and another change we forgot to mention. That was when DSL was first coming to our area. Dial up
Mm.
was still pretty prevalent back then where we grew up.
Yes, and I never actually had dial-up in that area. I had dial-up in Colorado before I moved out there, and yeah, we only ever had the local cable provider, so we were lucky. But even then, it was still a little bit more of a hassle than it is now. Like now, you don't even think it's like you buy a system, you pop it in, and within 5 seconds you're connected. But back then, it was
Yeah,
an adventure
yeah, to
into the
say the
back of the
least.
desk. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I remember back in the day trying to play World of Warcraft at my grandma's house.
Yeah.
And she still had dial up, and I remember it was like so miserable. And then she lives out in the sticks, and she got HughesNet, and I remember being like blown away. It was an awful experience trying to play on HughesNet, but
Hmm.
I still was like blown away by the idea of actually playing World of Warcraft like out in the middle of nowhere. Just the idea that that's even possible.
I think everybody had that grandparent experience. The grandparent who was on dial up a little too long. And I think my grandma who lives in Arkansas had hers for well into the middle of the 2000s. And at that point, we had, the DS connected to the internet. And I remember hooking that up and trying to connect to Mario Kart and having those experiences of like just the worst, most unplayable
Mm-hmm.
lag. But at the
Mm-hmm.
time, you were a lot more tolerant of it. It was like that was the price of doing business, right? Like,
Yeah.
well, I want to play online. I'm gonna have to make do with it. And we even had that experience of World of Warcraft slightly in a different way. It was mostly because of hardware limitations of our computer. But that combined with our internet speed made that like a really chunky experience. But you just, you know, back then it wasn't like bad ping, get out. It was like bad ping, welcome to the club. We're all we're all here with you, and we're just barely like able to play this game to a functional degree. But we're just so happy to be connected to so many people that we're just going to put up with it.
Yeah, I mean, that actually made me think. Gaming on dial up, I think the only game that I really played via dial up was Creatures. Did you ever hear about this?
I've certainly never heard of creatures.
It was this kind of like really, really articulate artificial life simulator where, you have these little, the eponymous creatures, right? And they had like distinct genomes and simulated brains with neurons and all that.
It's like what Spore was supposed to be.
Kinda, yeah. It was a lot less procedural than Spore, but in terms of like a life simulation, it was way ahead of its time. But this game had a community around it, right?
Hmm.
And you could share like your creature genome, little objects and levels you could make in the game, and there was like a community devoted to that. And I can remember like downloading other people's creatures, genetically modifying them, uploading them over dial up, and it taking like 20 minutes just to upload this little, genome file for other people on the creatures forum to
Hmm.
have their fun with. Now it's like the studio that made creatures has been defunct for I think like 10 years now. That community is scattered to the wind. The experience of playing the games is like totally different just due to the social and technological change that surrounds it and gives it context. We talked about the games we played as kids. The games I play now are totally different. A lot more variety and a lot less Halo, unless you count Destiny. But other than that, I don't really play MMOs that often. I log into Final Fantasy 14 every few months. You know, it's not like it was back in the day where I would be playing, a lot of Halo and a lot of World of Warcraft, and that was pretty much it. Like those were pretty much the only games I played back in the day for a while. And
Hmm.
now, it's a lot of single player, it's a lot of multiplayer action games. I like to play Monster Hunter, Dark Souls, Bloodborne. Those are great online experiences that I could never have had as a kid.
Well, so I don't know much about Dark Souls or Demon Souls or any of the Souls types of games, but that kind of online experience is pretty, it is asymmetrical, right? Like it's not like a direct interaction, or am I totally off base?
So it's kind of like you can summon other players or they can invade you.
Mm.
And so they're playing as the same kind of character as you are, and they're either trying to help you or hinder you as you
Oh,
progress
okay.
through the level, right?
I see. So that's
Yeah,
and yeah, that's a pretty unique experience. Certainly speaks to the diversification of the kind of games you can play online
right,
because it's not just like you said, it is not just Halo, it is not just another shooter. It
right.
is a very intricate role-playing game where you can hop in and pal around with your buds.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, well, so there's also an element of like anonymity to it. You can't
Right.
just, for the most part, there are ways around it, but for the most part, you don't just like go to your friends list and they drop in for you.
Hmm.
For the most part, you're relying on the kindness of strangers or their maliciousness when they invade you, right? And I think the technology to do that, would have been around very early on, but conceptually, it's so far out of the wheelhouse of what you were seeing back in those
Hmm.
days. No one was really thinking of these kinds of weird multiplayer experiences.
That makes me think of Journey. Did you ever play or hear much about Journey?
I'm familiar with it conceptually. In fact, I think I watched you play it once because you had a
It's,
PS3 back in high school.
I was that kid with a PS3. That
Yeah.
is correct. But yeah, that was a similar type of multiplayer experience where the whole idea was that you could just at any moment, as you're making your adventure in that game, your journey, if you will, at any point another player could join you, but it wasn't like a friend list invite. It wasn't anything. It was just like all of a sudden. So you'd be wandering over a dune in the desert or sliding down this sand slide, and then all of a sudden you'd look over and you'd say, "Hey, there's another guy like me." And it was neat because, I'm sure this is similar to Dark Souls, but you had no communication really other than
Mm.
you could press a button to chirp at them. And it always made, I think I finished that game two or three times, and it made each play feel very different in a way that a single player game of that type made a few years prior just couldn't have, because that idea, that creative thinking with connectivity wasn't something that you saw a lot of.
Yeah, it really is like the technology was there, at least in theory.
To me, when I think about something like Dark Souls or Demon Souls or Journey or whatever, like you think about how multiplayer was thought of as like a separate walled garden. So you have single player, and then on the other side of that walled garden, you have multiplayer. And you have your people who only go for the multiplayer and your people who only go for the single player. And the idea of mixing those things seamlessly wasn't like the popular thing to do. It wasn't what anybody sought out. And it was those kind of games that broke that mold in a lot of ways. Even something like Fable 2, where the people are like floating around or something, like your friends who are playing at the same time, and then you can be like, hey, come join me. Like that kind of stuff. Like that was weird and very strange at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the magic of Destiny. Honestly, is kind of taking that traditionally single player shooter and creating, an almost forced multiplayer experience where, you're pretty much always surrounded by other players no matter what you do. I said it's derivative of Halo in a mechanical sense, but in the way, you interact with other players, there's still room for that kind of traditional competitive multiplayer. And there's not really couch co-op, but you do play in that co-op sense a lot, but it's with strangers now. And that made me think of, another big change over the years has been the move away from server browsers and sort of, micro communities like that
Hmm.
over to like big pool matchmaking
Mm.
where, there's some kind of algorithm that just dumps you in a group with, 6 to 8 strangers that you'll never ever see again and you'll probably never really interact with. Back in the day, you joined a lobby and that was like, you were joining a community and you could
Right.
see like regular players there.
Yeah, I've always had very split opinions on that, because when that was a thing, it was always like finding the right server was such a taxing thing. It was like you jump into so many different servers and go, oh no, these people are terrible. Oh, this person's a monster. And then eventually you'd find one that was just right, and you just wanted to hang out there. When matchmaking became the standard issue item, it was like, okay, I can get rid of all that. I don't have to look through this or think about this. And that's very convenient. But sometimes I think about those early days playing Team Fortress 2 pre-hat
Mm-hmm.
catastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
I think about having that server list, and I used to hang out in this, it was a Chicago-based server, and it was all these people, mostly that you could tell like knew each other, and so the chat was a lot of banter back and forth, or they'd be like ordering wings for each other or whatever, and it was just kind of like a nice place to hang out. And I didn't communicate or anything, but it just felt like very homey in a way,
Yeah.
and you can't really replicate that experience in most games. I'm sure there are some like MMOs, of course, that foster that. But like, you think of something like a Team Fortress 2. I mean, I haven't played Team Fortress 2 in years, but I'm pretty sure the last time I played it had the matchmaking and it was just like totally different. It sapped so much of the charm that I remember it having because it was just going from match with random people to another match with random people, and it was just like, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think that modern matchmaking has become more of a burden than anything. It puts people who don't necessarily share the same goals for multiplayer experience and tosses them together
Yeah,
in a way that, most people aren't going to be satisfied. I think that that is honestly the source of a lot of the perceived toxicity in multiplayer games is that you have people who just want to chill out, just want to play a game after work, have some fun,
hmm,
unwind. And then you have people who've, play this game like 6, 8 hours a day and they're here to win, you
yeah. They
know.
don't have time for your nonsense.
Exactly, exactly. And then you have people who are just kind of like, I don't know, they're just screwing around, right? Well, you have people who just want to mess around and try like a unique build in League of
Hmm.
Legends, we'll say something like that. They're there to experiment. They're there for novelty, and they're playing a game where, as an example, you have one map, and you're playing the same mode again and again and again and again. And they want a little bit of novelty as opposed to people who want to play by a strict meta, right?
Yeah, I see a lot of this, and I don't know. I mean, we have a section a little bit later talking about the future, but you you bringing this up, I think, is a really good point that it has brought together a lot of people who ought not be together. And the game that pops to my mind most of all is Overwatch, which I was pretty fond of when it first came out, because when it first came out, it was like a pretty relaxed, chill environment. I was playing on a console and it was pretty active. And then the rush to make that a competitive game, to make it esports viable, made Blizzard, forced Blizzard's hand into making a lot of decisions. They took quick play, the quick play mode, which is like the casual mode, and they made it so at first you could just choose any one of their 20 or so characters, and you could choose any one of them and everybody could choose that same person. You could have like three McCrees on a team if you wanted. I mean, it was not conducive to winning, but you had that freedom. You could just kind of enjoy it. But then as the rush to make it competitively viable came about, and their community, a lot of the people in it wanted games to be more competitive because that was their mindset. Blizzard made quick play have a rule where you could only have one of each hero, and that was fine and whatever. And you were still thrown into the same pool with the people who want to take the game seriously and the one people who just want to have fun, which was me. And then a few months passed, and then they said, "Oh, that's not gonna be enough." And I think it was recently they made it where you had to pick, like, I'm gonna queue for support, I'm gonna queue for attack, I'm gonna queue for tank, or whatever, healer, or whatever it was, and you were stuck in that role, and you couldn't switch mid game. If you said I'm gonna be the healer, you were the healer until you pulled yourself out of the queue. And the reason they did that is because they had these players, these competitive players, mixed in with people like me, and there was just this natural collision of personalities and tastes, and Blizzard made a choice to go with the competitive side of things because that was the way the business was moving for Overwatch, but it just really made the experience, I think, really sour for a lot of people. I mean, I was never exposed to too much toxicity. I just kind of got out of it because I realized they were moving the game away from anything I wanted to play. But whenever you hear stories about that game, it's people who are on competitive reporting people for not playing the meta or doing this or that, and it's because they are just lumped in, one size fits all. We're going to use an algorithm and put you with these people no matter what your preference is.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point about competitive players. I think that competitive spirit in games, generally speaking, is kind of in a chicken and egg scenario, right? You used to be back in the lobby days. There were competitive guys out there, and there were certainly competitive lobbies that were like, dedicated to that kind of play. But for the most part, at least in my experience, people didn't really take it too seriously. They were
Mm-hmm.
there to have some fun,
Mm-hmm.
and if you wanted to go to like a super competitive mode, they had a lobby for you. It's called the competitive lobby. But now, it seems like you're really pressured to play that way, even if that's not
Mm-hmm.
what you want. And the reason I say it's kind of a chicken and egg is back in the day there were game tournaments. Famously, like Quake had a really active tournament scene for a long time. There wasn't like this esports league, and now you have games that aren't even out yet, and the developer is announcing like their esports plans and how they're
Mm-hmm.
going to have like a league, and they're going to have tournaments around the country,
Mm-hmm.
and they're going to put up 500,000 bucks in prize money, and the
Right.
game isn't out. The best example of this is Lawbreakers. Much hyped. They're talking about, oh, it's a competitive game, it's a hardcore game, it goes back to the arena shooter days. I think Cliffy B called it the Dark Souls of arena shooters or something like that.
Of course you did.
And they actually had a tournament, down in Denver, and there weren't enough entries into the tournament. And they had to cancel or something like that, if I recall.
Mm-hmm.
But like before the game even released, they were talking about, we're gonna have an esports scene. Heroes of the Storm. That's another big one where Blizzard
Yeah.
created this like artificial esports scene.
Yeah. And they
And
were on ESPN. Like
yeah,
that was
yeah,
how much they invested in it.
yeah. And then one day they just pulled the plug and said, the scene is dead. The community is dead now. All you people who have, major careers based around this game, go pound sand. That's one thing that another buddy of mine and I we talk about a lot is the change in gaming, both in terms of like competitive esports gaming and the more social like streamer side of the gaming
Mm-hmm.
community now, where you have these like entertainer personalities. You have guys out there who are basing their lives around employers with which they have no or very loose contracts with. You can be banned from Twitch at any time, and there goes your career.
And just in seconds, like it's just they make the call.
Yeah,
You are suddenly bad for business, or you just aren't business, and
yeah,
that's that.
yeah, and then you're out on your ass, right? I mean, this would have been unthinkable 20, even 15 years ago. It still baffles me. Like, I still just find it so alien and so bizarre that there are people, who submit themselves to that kind of work. What's stopping the game you play from being the next Heroes of the Storm? What's stopping you from being the next guy to get banned off Twitch for whatever reason, right? And there goes your livelihood.
Yeah, and you think about a lot of people who like fighting games have been a big esport for a long time, maybe the longest of any genre. And you have all these people who spend all this time who have to play many different games because most fighting games don't have that long of a shelf life in the tournament scene. And then, something like Evo that just disappears because of issues at the top of management. Like that isn't directly comparable to anything else. Like that doesn't happen in football. Like if the commissioner of the NFL is a total creep, everybody just says business as usual, the Super Bowl still happens. They don't just pull Evo out from you and possibly a huge source of income depending on what tier of player you are. You might be expecting to have some kind of payout and then it just drops off the face of the earth for a year. And there's no contract, there's nothing to say to catch you when you fall.
Right. Yeah, you have no legal protection. You have no recourse. The rug can just be pulled out from under you, and that's your whole life. A couple weeks ago, one of the big Destiny guys, he had a Me Too moment and he got canceled. Like, that guy has kids. He's got a mortgage payment all
Mm-hmm.
gone now. Like, why would you put yourself in that position when you have, especially, when you have responsibilities and obligations like a family. It baffles me. But you have young kids who are like, that's who they look up to. That's what they want to
Yeah,
get into
that's
now.
I work with children and I can tell you that a lot of them talk about streamers. Like they don't talk about TV shows quite as much. It is like YouTube personalities
Yeah,
or these people who make their life streaming games. Like you said, it boggles the mind for me. I can't wrap my head around that. But that is the state of things. That is part of our connected future is people watching influential people play games, and that's just how it is.
yeah. It's really strange to me because, like I said, I'm older than my siblings are. But when I go back home, for like a family reunion, Thanksgiving, whatever, the phrase "so there's this YouTuber" comes up a lot, and these kids will like talk about YouTubers and Twitch streamers that they like amongst themselves, or they'll be like, "Did you see I don't know Markiplier or whomstever said this one thing or did this one thing on that video? Did you see that video or that stream?" And it's like bizarre to me, that these video game guys are like celebrities now. I mean, I think it's fair to say that you and I both, we really did grow up with video games. I mean, I would have never conceived that playing video games would get you such a degree of celebrity.
Right, and I think that's part of, drawing it back to the community, drawing it back to the influence on multiplayer and that experience online, because we got into this talking about competitive people, and then, naturally that transitions to influencers. It's almost like back in the reality show boom when people
Mm-hmm.
were looking at reality shows and they were like, if I can just be the biggest idiot on TV, I could set myself up for life. And so now you have these people who are like, either A, I can really devote myself to Dota 2 and I can be an awesome player, and then I get on one of these sponsored teams. I can go to the international and make so much money that I won't have to work a regular job. Or you have other people who look at Twitch and they say, if I just really develop myself some kind of personality
A brand.
and if I develop a brand for myself and I find the right game, that could be my rags to riches story. And now I think what happens is drawing back into the community, you have normal people who would just normally be just playing games casually, looking at that and going, that could be me. And it changes the way they play games. They're not playing them just to unwind, they're playing them to possibly make a name for themselves or possibly gain a following on Twitch or something. And it just makes the dynamic very strange. It makes them a little bit defensive, right? When they encounter me, who's just some, nitwit who's trying to do something before he passes out at 10 o'clock at night. It drives them batty because they're like, my future could be at stake, and you just want to pick this terrible support character when we already have three of them. Like, what's your deal? Like, I just think it totally changes the vibe of a community, and has changed the way that the multiplayer community interacts with each other, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on. What you said really made me think about how you and I, and Derek as well, and I think, most, if not all, of the people we hang out with, all these changes, all of this, like, competitive gaming, esports, Twitch, match made, style algorithmic play has passed us by. I don't think, off the top of my head, any of us really play like competitive games like that anymore.
No, I mean, like I said, I really enjoyed Overwatch, but the competitive nature of that community and the way that Blizzard designed the game started to make changes to the game that only catered to those people, like that chased me out. And, there's other games I really enjoyed, like Rocket League. I was really into for a while, and that one, the developer was pretty hands off as far as changes of that go, but the community saw the way that game was evolving into an esport, and that just became a very unpleasant place to play for me, someone who just wants to unwind. it's chased me almost entirely towards games where you can't, like, if I'm going to play online, it's a game where I can't communicate. There's really no sense of like community at all. It is just like a time waster.
Hmm.
And if people are pissed at me, that's it. Like, I don't hear anything about it. Like, I'm off in my own little silo. Nobody's getting mad at me playing Splatoon. And if they are, they're using the Switch Online app and I can't hear them, so who cares? It has alienated me, and I mean, I think most people we know too. It's not a way that we enjoy spending time because none of us, we all have accepted that we are not going to be great esports players. We're not going to be influencers on Twitch. We are just a bunch of people with jobs who want to hang out, and that demographic isn't really catered to by a lot of these things anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you say that it's kind of chased you away from multiplayer games. I've adapted to it in a very different way where, for reference for the audience, you and I, we're more high school buddies. And we both acquired a different friend group when we went to college where, we still hung out, but there were other people we hung out with too. And a lot of my college buddies, they're more into like PC games, but they're very much in the non-competitive boat like we are. I still play a lot of multiplayer games with those guys. We'll just fire it up and screw around for a while, and that'll be that. No like competitive, no matchmaking, no PvP. Remnant from the Ashes. We were playing that a few weeks back, and it's very much like Dark Souls with guns, basically, in a nutshell.
Hmm.
And it's like three-player co-op, and we're just rolling through. It's a multiplayer game. It's totally different from the prevailing trade winds of
Yeah.
multiplayer games right
And
now, right?
if you are of our demographic and really just want to have a good time, you pretty much have to have a group of people because otherwise you are slotted with random people and they're just, probably going to be the type of people who are competitive minded and don't have time for your nonsense. You have to have friends who are like-minded and arrange multiplayer plans with them to get that experience you want.
Well, yeah, I mean, we talked a lot about the trends we see now and how they passed us by, and looking into the future, I think that we're gonna continue to be in that boat. We talked a little bit about the Ubisoft conference last week and our predictions for it. Out of nowhere, they announced a battle royale game, all the rage, right? It's the newest genre to chase. But what stood out to me was this is like it has Twitch integration where viewers can like
Yeah,
vote on
that's right.
what's going to happen in the match, like
Hmm.
events in game.
Hmm.
That is like so out of my depth. I mean, I hate BR games in general, so I'm already like a decrepit boomer. But the idea of like, having, getting randomly thrown in a match with, I don't know, Ninja or whomever, and his viewers vote that like, okay, we're gonna like turn the gravity off, and it's gonna be really wacky for Ninja to react to that. That is like so infuriating to me. I don't know what it is, but something about it just it pisses me off that some random guy's fame is now dictating my gameplay experience to any degree.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it because I remember them mentioning the Twitch integration, and I've heard people talk about it. Mostly, from what I understand, it hasn't. A lot of people haven't experienced it, but the game isn't. It just recently really got out into the wild. For a while, it was in a closed beta with a very select group of people getting in. I'm with you that it's just when I look at that, it's unsporting and it's you come into a multiplayer experience and you want everybody to have the same, ideally, you want everybody to have the same experience and the same potential. But when you have these kind of integrations, it's not like that. It's almost like you are being unwillingly pulled into their entertainment show. Like you are now a part of an influencer spectacle, and your experience with the game is secondary to their experience.
Yeah, I mean you're a circus clown. basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you are dancing for the audience, and Ubisoft doesn't care if you have a good time. They care if Ninja plays their game and has a good time, and his followers have a good time watching him do that. But it is just very foreign to me, that idea that you would want your own experience to be deprecated to improve one other person in a very powerful position's experience.
We've all heard of pay to win, right? I mean, maybe now we're approaching fame to win. Like right now, it starts
Oh,
out
we
pretty
already have that
mundane.
in real life.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's always been the sticking point with me is back in the day there was this kind of fantasy with games like World of Warcraft where you didn't know anything about the other people playing beyond what they presented in their character, and then it kind of moved to like, okay, that guy's got the coolest mount, costs $20, right? I mean, that's got to be a high roller. I was a sophomore in high school when Lich King came out, so that kind of stuff really was like a big deal to me because I didn't have a job yet. Even today when I see a guy with microtransaction gear or whatever, like all that cosmetic crap, it's like, damn, you're an idiot. You know, like it's supposed to look really impressive. And now, when if I were to play this, this Ubisoft BR, I don't even remember what it's called.
Hyperscape.
Hyperscape, yeah. If I were to play this and a message appeared on my screen that said XXX Shit Eater 420's viewers have voted to like invert controls for everybody in the match for the next 30 seconds or something, I would be so disgusted that I was like within 6 degrees of separation of someone like this.
It's just not ideal for me, and it's just you, if Star Trek were real, and if there were video games in Star Trek, they wouldn't put up with this kind of stuff. They wouldn't put up with this non-egalitarian style of gaming, and I'm not all for it either.
Well, of course, in Star Trek, they have the video game that mesmerizes you. Have you seen that episode?
I haven't seen that episode though.
Oh, okay. It's like the best '90s video game scaremongering I've ever seen. But it does, prominently feature virtual reality, and I'm really interested to see where VR goes. I think VR chat is the sort of novelty experience of today that Demon Souls multiplayer. We talked about how innovative that was back in the day. I think something like VR chat is the modern equivalent in some way. Just in the fact that it's this weird experience that you couldn't otherwise have. And I
Hmm.
wonder what we're gonna see next out of VR.
Yeah, it's hard to say because it's just not still, I feel like, is not super accessible, though
Right.
it is certainly more so than it was when the first set of headsets came out.
It's not
And it
pervasive.
No, and it's not like, I think for a lot of normal consumers who end up being the demographic that publishers look to, like it has not reached them. It is still within our very, very, very niche subset of the world. And so it's really hard to say where that could go because you just don't know what people are going to look for in VR. Is it going to be like Ready Player One where our world has been ravaged and they're just looking for some kind of pithy MMO to spend their time on because the real world sucks? Or is it going to be something like VR chat where it's just like a really strange, unusual, unseemly experience that you just couldn't have anywhere else? Like it's really hard to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that VR games in general are so embryonic right now. I think I mentioned to you playing on my buddy's VR headset when I went to visit him a while back, and the games are so anemic, I guess is the
Hmm.
best word I can think of, where it's like,
Hmm.
generally speaking, I probably played like 8 or 9 different games over the course of the evening, and I would say that only like 2, 3 of those had like actual, unique gameplay. There
Hmm.
were like 3 categories of games. You had shoot and teleport to a space.
Hmm.
You had slash and teleport around to a space, and then you have Beat Saber. where you're standing still and you're just kind of like standing and moving.
It's very
And
Wii, very very
yes,
Wii
yeah,
development.
it does remind me a lot of that, or like Connect, right?
Yeah,
And Connect never really found its feet.
yeah, and they never figured out what to do with it because VR, and that's probably what VR may have some advantage because a lot of games with VR still have you using a controller, so you still have that designated input, but they never could figure out how to replace the type of interactiveness that a normal controller provides. It just always ended up feeling less interactive, even though in theory you'd think it would be more so. And that's kind of where VR is at, it seems like.
We're still waiting for really compelling single player VR games. I think, I haven't played it, but I think Half-Life Alyx might be the trendsetter in a lot of ways for that. I'm anxious to see like what's going to be the big multiplayer VR experience and how is that going to, what kind of trends is that going to set? I mean, I would be interested in seeing like some kind of wild VR battle royale game or something like that, where I hate BRs, but I would be interested in watching people play that. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
watching them, duck, dip, dodge, and dodge. But
Dip,
like
dip,
with
duck,
the
dive, and dodge.
yeah, 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 with that like huge headset, right? And
Yeah,
just make an ass of themselves on camera until, of course, they like topple over, vomit, or whatever. Like how do you balance that out? I think that's going to be one of the big drivers of multiplayer innovation.
and you could see that happening with those devices becoming more mobile,
Hmm.
um, and not tied to a physical computer. At that point, it might open up the software possibilities in the sense that more developers might feel inclined to get in there and share some just really bizarre ideas.
Yeah, and, it's funny you mentioned mobile devices. I think mobile multiplayer is another trend that's passed us by, but we talked a little bit about xCloud the other day, like cloud
Mm.
gaming and Stadia and stuff like that. I wonder how that's going to impact multiplayer culture as a whole, where that asshole who's not playing League of Legends correctly, he's like on the shitter or something,
Yeah, yeah,
at work. He could be like on the job taking a lunch break or something. And I mean, in the future, I mean, you may see these technologies converge where people have the 7G bandwidth to, stream like a really complex competitive multiplayer game to their headset, their VR headset, and then, stream like what they're seeing, their point of view to like Twitch or something. And you'll have people like, oh yeah, turn off his like left side peripheral vision or something. It'll be totally bizarre. I mean, I think the audience interaction is probably like the most cautious trend right now in
hmm
multiplayer for me. Like it's probably the thing that would put me off the most.
hmm
But at the same time, I wanna know how deep the rabbit hole is gonna go. I wanna see like when are influencers gonna draw the line with letting their audiences fuck with them while they try to play a video game?
it, whenever the money stops showing up.
Sure, yeah, that's probably it.
It's interesting though because that is one of the one thing that Stadia has that I think I've heard people be express some amount of enthusiasm for is the idea that you could be streaming a game on YouTube and your viewers could interact with you or even join you. And they had a Stadia conference that I'm sure 5 people watched last week, and I know I saw a few updates from it that mentioned that that was the direction a lot of their games, like instead of doing more of what traditional consoles are doing, Stadia was starting to introduce. I heard them described as comparable to like those IO games. Are you familiar with the like
Mm-hmm. Agar
Slither I?
IO,
Yeah,
that
those
kind of
kind of
thing.
games. The kind of games that kids play in school when they're supposed to be doing work. Like those kind of games, it seemed like Stadia was getting into that, but in a sense where you are streaming it and people are watching you stream it and they interact with you or join you. And that could be a really interesting divergence for multiplayer. Like you, I'm not sure it's something I'm super interested in, but I could see there being some amount of potential in that regard.
I will say the whole idea of people like tuning into a stream and joining on the streamer, that is
Hmm.
another idea that just stinks, just reeks. Because, playing in a lobby with a streamer sucks. Playing in a lobby full of like shit-eating fanboys for that streamer, that's gonna
Hmm.
be terrible. Like,
Yeah.
that's gonna be unplayable because if you're not towing the streamer's party line, these guys are gonna VTK you instantly,
Hmm.
or they're just gonna make your game a living hell till you leave, right?
This might be more appealing for like the lay people. I think about the way that, you know, in the past I or you or Derek have streamed games just like among friends.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of like, oh, Derek's streaming, oh, what's something Derek plays? La Pucelle Tactics
Right.
2. He's playing the new La Pucelle Tactics, and I'm watching him on YouTube and going, wow, this looks like a lot of fun. I want to hop in there with him, and I have whatever access I need, and I can just go straight from the stream to suddenly I am playing with him. Like that idea to me is kind of interesting, but yes, taken to its logical extreme, which is you being in with a bunch of streamers, like that is not ideal, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll continue to reinforce some of the influences we talked about earlier, where people get more and more competitive, more and more serious, and if you're not really there for that, you're going to be more and more alienated, and you're going to be
Hmm.
forced out, and it'll just be like, I can see a dystopia where the only people playing games are like warring factions of streamers and their fans.
Mm.
They're just like all joined up on each other, and you have Team Ninja. Ninja has like 1 million people willing to just join on him at a moment's notice and fill out the blue team roster, and then you have Team I don't know, Gothalion or something, and he's got like 1 million guys who are just willing to join on him and fill out the red team. And it's going to be nothing but streamers fighting streamers and their fans fighting their fans.
This is the worst Mad Max sequel that's ever been pitched.
Mad Max, Streamer Road.
Oh man, yeah, that's a dark future that I don't want to think about. I think something with the future that I have been a little more optimistic about is that I don't know if you've noticed this as much, but if you think back, let's say 10 years ago to the 360 PS3 era of multiplayer, the thing that was happening a lot with those games is that because publishers were so afraid of the used market, was that they were just shoehorning multiplayer into every single game. So I think about you mentioned Dead Space 3 as a game you quite like. That was a game that is a single player series by and large,
Yeah.
but they felt like, well, people are going to sell this game back really quick. We need to put multiplayer in there. And I think that was just cooperative, right? That wasn't
Mm-hmm.
competitive multiplayer. Yeah. But either way, it was like, they had to put it in there. And I think about games like Last of Us, super mopey dad game, and that had a multiplayer. Or Resident Evil 5 had the co op, but it also had a competitive multiplayer, even though that game controlled like sludge. Like every game had to have it. God of War, for God's sake, had multiplayer on the PS3. And then this recent generation, like you don't really see that anymore. You see single player games are kind of, for the most part, kind of on their own. You have your Call of Duties and stuff that have all of it, but they've separated out your multiplayer experiences and your single player experiences. And I think it's really benefited the multiplayer in a lot of cases because I feel like it doesn't feel as tacked on as it used to. It doesn't feel like developers are just trying to extend the life of a game. They are designing a game totally around this idea of multiplayer, and it's allowing them to be a little bit more responsive with it, to keep it more interesting, keep it more fresh with regular updates because they're not worried about single player content or anything like that. I think that's been a positive change, and I don't see that stopping in the future. I mean, at this point, I feel like odds are most every multiplayer game is just going to be free and then supported by microtransactions. That is a negative consequence, but I do feel like there has been some positive from multiplayer becoming so popular that it is now its own genre and does not have to just tag along with whatever AAA games are big, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's also had really positive consequences for single player games, which, something like Horizon Zero Dawn, I don't think that has multiplayer. Derek
No,
was talking
no,
about
that has
that.
no multiplayer, right? And I don't think any of those Sony games, which a generation ago
Yeah,
absolutely would have, like, I think Uncharted 4 still had it because I think actually
it was
liked
an early
Uncharted
title.
multiplayer. Yeah, and people liked Uncharted multiplayer on the PS3, but like God of War, there was no thought given to adding multiplayer to that game. I mean, it
Ghost
would
of
have been
Tsushima.
cool. Ghost of Tsushima has no multiplayer. Like nothing like Last of Us 2, they deliberately said, "No, we are not putting multiplayer in this game." And we've come a long that means we've come a long way since like BioShock 2, which was like the game that and Metroid Prime 2 are the two games I think of when it's like, why would you put multiplayer in this? Like nobody's here for the multiplayer, and you're taking away, in theory, you're taking away resources from the single player to add this stupid feature to this game that nobody actually wants. And now you don't really have that as much.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of a cost benefit analysis for a lot of developers. Um, we talked about in our first or second episode, former PlayStation boss. I can't remember his name. Um,
Layden? Was it Sean Layden?
yeah, he talked about how games are kind of trapped in this idea of like we need to spend 300, 400 million dollars over the course of 5 or 6 years to create this expansive 80-hour experience where most of it is just drudgery and it's
Mm-hmm.
just there arbitrarily. And he kind of asks the question, what's wrong with spending a quarter of that budget, 2 solid years, and just making the game you need to make, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, the game you need to make typically does not include multiplayer. And if the game you need to make is multiplayer, maybe the only single player you need is a little tutorial, right?
Yeah, you don't
If that.
need, yeah,
Yeah.
you don't need these games like where, the joke used to be like Call of Duty. Nobody actually plays the single player, they just hop in for the multiplayer. So why are you spending all this time making a single player? And now Call of Duty still has one, but now you don't have other games that are like that where it's like, why did you even make this single player? Or why did you even make this multiplayer? You have this divergence now where they are two separate things, and that's, I think, positive in some ways, but also in some ways, I think negative because if you think about multiplayer games largely now being free, like I
Mm-hmm.
can't remember the last big multiplayer game, Call of Duty aside, which I think I should be a given because that's just an anomaly
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of ways. But most of these games are free, and in some ways that's nice. For me as someone who has said he's been kind of chased out of multiplayer games, I like that when they do come out, if I hear word of mouth that makes it sound interesting, I can just jump in and I can have that experience for free. Like, I didn't play it, but when Apex Legends came out and there was a lot of hubbub around that, the idea that I could jump in and play this and get that experience for free and see what it's like before dropping any money, that was appealing. But I think about, as someone who works in education, these games are free, but obviously with the caveat of being supported by microtransactions and your battle passes and all that. And, having worked with children, obviously I've heard a lot about Fortnite. And for them, the idea of a microtransaction is just a given. Like, they do not flinch about buying the new battle pass or paying this much to get V-Bucks to buy a skin. Whereas, people from our generation, we get in for free and then we get out, and we can't even fathom the idea that someone would actually drop their hard-earned money on this game that they're already getting for free. But we are going to be replaced by these people, these young people, and they're going to come of age just accepting microtransactions as just part of the business. And you have to imagine that publishers are going to find ways to exploit that.
Oh, I'm confident publishers already have, the highest paid psychologists in the world picking away, trying to lobotomize customers like every other, big firm selling a product. But I actually have a little bit more of an optimistic view on that. I think that, kids are definitely being taught that microtransactions, loot box gambling, that sort of shit, it's normal. But I wonder how much of their willingness can be chalked up to youth. I know that when I was in high school, I think I bought like one skin on League of Legends at one point and thought that was like a terrible waste of money. But the temptation was that, when you're young, you want to stand out, you want to look
Hmm.
cool, you want to be impressive to your peers, and a lot of, at least from what I understand from like my little brother and stuff like that, you play those games with your friends,
Yes.
after school, and
Hmm.
you wanna stand out and you wanna express yourself in the game. And I wonder, when these kids start to get a little older and they start going to college, if they're still gonna hold on to that habit or if they'll kind of, grow out of it.
Yeah, it could be something like, when we were kids, maybe spending all that money on trading cards, for
Yeah,
Pokemon and
exactly.
whatnot. Yeah, you do tend to grow out of those kind of habits. Though I do worry because, like I make jokes when I talk about Fortnite and I go, "Oh, my favorite skin is the default." And they just bust up at that. They think that's the funniest thing in the entire world.
Oh
And
man,
you
this
like
old man doesn't care to, dress up his little virtual
right,
doll.
right, and you just wonder like, they just like to them the idea of not buying a skin is weird. And to me, the idea of buying a skin is just unthinkable. So it does make me worry, but I think you bring up a good point that a lot of those habits do change over time. I think what but would be interesting is to maybe gouge my younger brother who's in a generation that's kind of there in the middle, right, where they came about where the internet was already very well established and they were in high school and are starting college in this era of free to play microtransactions. And I kind of wonder if his peers are continuing as they're in college now to invest monetarily in these free games and these microtransactions. I know my younger brother does not, but he's cheap like me, so that's his whole thing. But I
Mm-hmm.
just kind of wonder if
Mm-hmm.
maybe if he's he's probably not indicative of his generation. I'd be curious to learn more about their proclivities.
Well, speaking of dark futures, why don't we reminisce a little on some memories of the past? What would you say are some of your like most memorable, most cherished multiplayer or just sharing a game with someone memories?
Oh man. So this is not my story. It is Derek's story, but I
Yeah.
feel obligated to share it because it's a good starter because it, paints the picture of multiplayer in its early infancy. And so he was very, very much into Starcraft. And him and all of his friends got into Starcraft and they would play every weekend night, hours and hours and late into the evening. And, I remember specifically he was starting to get into like high ranking clan matches where he was trying to earn favor among his peers. And these are very serious competitive matches.
Mm-hmm.
And he was very, Derek seems like a very fun loving man on this podcast, but when he is devoted to something, he can be very fiery with his
Yes.
passion. And I had a friend over one night and we were hanging out in our basement and my mom had told us it was time to go to bed. It was about 10 at night. And so I, being a rule follower, hopped into my little bed in the basement and said, "All right, hey, time to go to bed." I told my friend, when you turn off the TV, you need to go to bed. That's what my mom said to do. And my friend, like a normal child, didn't listen and he continued to stay up and watch TV. And at one point, he saw a commercial for the movie Signs. Do you remember Signs?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Of course, M. Night Shyamalan classic. And I think the scene in the commercial that really got him was the scene where the alien walks between the crops.
yeah.
It just walks in and like it's such a spooky moment, right? And I was probably 9 or 10 when this happened, so my friend was probably 9 or 10 as well. And he saw that and he just bawled. He was just crying. He was beside himself. It was the scariest thing he'd ever seen in his entire life. And he ran upstairs, and the only person in the house who was awake was Derek. And Derek was playing Starcraft, but my friend was wailing, crying. He wanted to call his mom, but we had dial up. So
Yeah.
Derek was in this very serious match, and he had to decide between his clan and his friends or this crying, screaming child in front of him. And of course, like any rational human being, Derek made the choice to unplug his connection and sacrifice his clan match for my friend could call his mom and go home. But that is always what I think of when I think of multiplayer memories. It's not even my own memory. It is just this moment. For me, it was waking up the next day going, "Where the heck did my friend go?" And then Derek just being like, "Well, I was in the middle of a very serious StarCraft match, and your friend came upstairs and interrupted me."
Another Blizzard game memory for me. I mentioned earlier that I started playing World of Warcraft in like sixth grade, and I was only allowed to play on weekends. But my buddy, who I could kind of gotten started with, he was allowed to play whenever he wanted. So he quickly outleveled me. I was playing a warlock, he was playing a hunter, and I had gone through Westfall, which is on like one end of the map,
Hmm.
and it was time for me to move on to Redridge.
Hmm.
And so we were trying to think like what would be the fastest way to get from Westfall to Redridge. We could just follow the road, but there are bandits on that road that are going to attack us, and that'll waste time, right?
Hmm.
So he had a skill as a hunter. He was in his like 40s, I think. You get that skill, aspect of the pack, where it makes your whole party run fast. But if you get hit, you get dazed. And I, being a warlock, had unending breath, which lets you breathe underwater. And there is a convenient river that runs between Westfall and Redridge. So we got it in our heads. We'll just cast unending breath, aspect of the pack, and we'll swim upriver. And I'm pretty sure, don't quote me on this one, but I'm pretty sure aspect of the pack does not increase your swim speed at all. But it does still stun you if you get hit. So like every Defias, every Murloc on that river was
Hmm.
like constantly stunning us, and it was so miserable, and it took us like 2.5 hours to get from Westfall to Redridge,
Uh,
but we had like the time of our lives because the
uh,
whole time we were talking about Molten Core and how cool it would be to raid.
hmm.
Like that's the definitive early 2000s multiplayer memory
Oh,
for me.
yes. So that makes me think of a very similar story in World of Warcraft. We have a mutual friend, you might call him Chad, and we were very into World of Warcraft in middle
Yeah,
school,
I
like
recall.
you. And oh yes, right. And so he was he was always a schemer. Back when World of Warcraft was a little, new and very mysterious at the time, especially if you're young and you weren't like looking in the certain corners of the internet. It was all this big world to you with so many possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
he was always scheming ways to make money was his thing. And so he would try and rope me in sometimes. And one of his schemes that he really tried to get me in on was a deviant fish
Yeah,
scheme. Do
yeah,
you remember the deviant delights?
yes,
So
yeah.
for listeners who don't remember this, deviant delight was a thing you could cook in World of Warcraft using a deviant fish, and if you eat it, it would transform you into a pirate or a ninja or something silly. And
Skeleton.
a skeleton, right? And so it was a fun little thing. And he had looked at the auction house and determined that this was a good way for us to make money at a time when making money in that game was difficult. However, in order to make Deviant Delights, you had to have the recipe. And he looked online, and the place where you could get that recipe was in Stranglethorn Vale. I can't remember the name of the town at the Cape of Stranglethorn Vale.
Hmm.
Um, but either way, that's not important. The main idea is that he told me the scheme is like, hey, I want to get this recipe. We were actually in school. It was a social studies class. I remember him turning around and saying, hey, you want to go to Stranglethorn Vale with me tonight? And I said, well, all right, sounds good. The problem was that neither of us was of an appropriate level for Stranglethorn Vale. I was probably in the maybe the early 20s at the highest. I was also a legendarily bad World of Warcraft player at the time. And he was a little bit higher, maybe low 30s, but he was a priest, so he was extremely squishy. So it was not very useful. And so we walked through and we got to Stranglethorn Vale. And much like you and your friend, we just were like, okay, we're just going to make a run for it. We can't stop and fight these enemies. We're just going to go. But back then, especially if you were a low level, the enemies would latch onto you from a much further range. They saw you as easy kills.
Yep.
So every few steps, especially me, a bear would jump out of the jungle and maul me. And then I'd revive. And then I'd go a few more steps, and then a tiger would jump out and maul me. And then I'd go a few steps, and then something else would get me. And so after like 30 minutes to an hour of doing this, and all my armor, you have the little armor indicator, everything is totally red. Like my character is practically naked. They are so defenseless. We finally arrived at the town, and he bought his recipe. And then every weekend, it seemed like for the next few months, we would go to this little cave and fish for our little deviant fish, and we'd sell our deviant delights for a handful of gold per thing. And it was just that silly adventure that spawned it. It was truly, like you said, it was a definitive early internet experience of all this wonder in the world out there, and being a little unprepared in our youth and just being waylaid by the game every step of the way.
Yeah, I mean, now that you mention it, another World of Warcraft story. This is a quick one. When I first started playing, I was just fooling around in the starting zone, and I happened to group up with another player, and we got to talking. I had offhandedly mentioned, what state I was from, and he goes, "Oh yeah, I'm in Alaska." And I remember being blown away that like I'm talking to this guy who's like way up north, just like telling my friends at school like, yeah, you can talk to people from anywhere in the world on this game. It's insane. I've never seen anything like it. And that's actually what got my buddy into that game, was the idea of like, you know, you could do anything in there, right? You could find anyone.
Hmm.
And
And
yeah, and now, modern WoW is nothing like that. I haven't
no,
played since Legion, but now it's like nobody talks,
no,
nobody groups up.
yeah, it
It's
is a
like silent.
single player game.
Yeah, yeah. Unless you bring friends with you, it's effectively
Yeah,
single player.
that's right, exactly.
And
And it's,
sometimes the NPCs like jump around or emote. You know, that's it.
yeah. And that was the cool thing. I don't know if you played Classic for a week like everybody else in the world, but I know
Nope.
Derek and I both hopped on Classic for 1 week, and it had no staying power. I'm not in the place in my life where I can play WoW, but it was kind of cool because everybody was talking again, and it reminded me of that experience in the early 2000s of hopping on the internet and being like, oh, I want to talk to these different people and quest with these strangers and like, have these conversations and learn about them. Whereas now, when I get online, I'm like, I don't ever want to interact with another human. They're all terrible and disgusting, and I'd rather just be off in my own little corner. Good day.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you say that about not wanting to interact or the internet. Do you remember when we played Portal 2
Yeah, how can
at
I
your
forget?
parents' house?
You were so enraged.
Yeah, I like so it was you, me, and another friend of ours, and we were waiting on a fourth friend to meet up. I don't think we even planned to play Portal that day.
No, we were gonna watch Batman and Robin.
Yeah, that's it. We were gonna watch Batman and Robin, and we had Chinese takeout, and
Hmm.
we were waiting for our other buddy, and he was like, I gotta mow the lawn today. I'm not gonna make it, guys. And
Oh,
so I think you were like, I just got this game, Portal 2. Do you guys want
well,
to
no,
play it?
it was his copy, the
Oh yeah,
lawnmower.
yeah, that's right. He like left his
He
copy,
had left it with us, so I was like, well, I guess we'll play it.
and so we started playing the multiplayer campaign, and we started trading off. I think we traded off like every level or something, and I remember you guys tormented me because I was like, getting into it, wanted to progress, wanted to see what was next,
Hmm.
and when I was not playing, or even when I was, you
Uh,
guys were sabotaging the level so that we couldn't progress. And I remember begging you, just hurry up, just finish this fucking level so we can get out of here and see what's in the next level.
yeah, we just wanted to goof around with the portal guns.
See, and I wanted to actually play the game.
Oh, yeah, it's not multiplayer adjacent, but I was watching someone play Uncharted. It was watching them play Uncharted, but they were doing it poorly,
Hmm.
and I was just like, now I understand how Setzer felt when he watched us play Portal 2. But
Yeah,
yeah, oh, yes, I have fond memories of that time for sure. For sure. It makes me think of I don't know how connected this is, but it makes me think of it. My wife and I play Overcooked. And Overcooked, if you don't know much about it, it's a cooperative game. It's like those Diner Dash type of games where you're trying to prepare meals. It's a very lighthearted, casual style game, but it's like all of those games. It's only like lighthearted and casual for the first 2 hours or so, which is where most people get their kicks. And then the further you get into it, it becomes this like demanding, unpleasant, unfeeling monster of a game. And my wife and I wanted to get perfect scores on everything. And so we devoted ourselves, hours every weekend just playing these levels over and over and over again. And it had this like, there was this positive aspect of like, relationship building and all that, but then there was the other aspect of like just being really like sometimes just really frustrated, like, hey, what the hell are you doing over there? Like you can't, you're not cleaning the dishes, you're throwing the ingredients in all the wrong places, like, or you're just you keep walking off the edge and costing us valuable seconds, and it just that frustration is so memorable to me. It really sticks out when I think about multiplayer memories.
yeah, it's funny you say that because I don't think my wife and I have ever actually, played like a multiplayer game together other than Minecraft. We played that
Hmm.
back when were in high school, but
Hmm.
we don't really play games together. We have very similar taste in single player games.
Hmm.
And so sometimes, we'll rent a game and take turns playing it and trade off.
Hmm.
But we don't really play multiplayer games together. Sometimes we'll play Final Fantasy 14 together, but you know, other than that, we don't really play multiplayer games. We will play single player games together instead.
Yeah, I think, we don't really talk about our partners too much, but you and Derek have partners who have grown up playing games to some extent. And my wife has almost no background with video games at all, so that has been the only way to really get her involved at all. And I never really cared either. I was never really like, oh, you need to like what I like. But it was something where I would like see these games online. I'd see a streamer playing them, and I'd be like, oh, that kind of looks like something that is approachable and friendly. And that's been a really pleasant memory, is getting my wife into Splatoon, getting my wife into Animal Crossing, getting my wife into Overcooked and some similar games to that. We finished Diablo 3 together. We finished Castle Crashers together. Like that's been those have been some really fun multiplayer memories, even though I will tell you, it teaches you a lot about like how the mind is conditioned to understand how to interact with games. And
Yeah.
you and I understand the language of games because we played them our whole life. My wife doesn't have that understanding, and even still, after playing a few different games for a year or two now, we'll play a game like Castle Crashers or something, or Diablo, and she'll just have no idea of these things that to me are just common sense, and it just drives you crazy. You're like, how do you not understand that this is how games work? I actually remember playing Halo with her, and we actually finished the first Halo together, which I truly don't know how we did. And we even played it on normal, I believe. So it wasn't like I cheaped out and went to easy so we could get through it. And the thing that was really hard for her was that second stick. And
Oh, really?
it was aiming with the second stick and moving at the same time and keeping track of me. And in the first Halo, those maps are not very um,
No.
shall we say, friendly.
Yeah.
So it was like, I remember playing, and it was a lot of fun because that game is extremely well designed and holds up in a lot of ways. But her, like, a lot of times it was me looking at the bottom half of the screen and going, look up, look up, look up, look to the left. That's me. You need to follow me. And it was like, those are really fond memories, but they also drove me up a wall.
Yeah, speaking of my wife, actually, I remember one time she was out of the house, and a mutual buddy of ours, he invited me over to play some games, and this is the first time I think either of us ever recorded ourselves playing a game because we got so smashed that night, and we were playing Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part One on the Xbox 360. I remember the next day he sent me that recording, and it's like unwatchable because we were just like stumbling around, mumbling, shouting, clearly confused, clearly intoxicated beyond belief. And, like, it's just totally incomprehensible what we're doing and why we're doing it. But I
Is that the
still,
same night that you downloaded the wallpaper for the Xbox
yeah!
360?
So, yeah, after we beat the game, it's part one, right? And so I was like, well, it's only 2 in the morning. We gotta play part two. So I ripped the controller out of his hand and I went to the Xbox store. And, keep in mind, he's like in no state to walk. And so I searched for, Harry Potter and Deathly Hallows Part 2, and I see it's available for like $3. And he happens to have like, $7.17 available on his account. So I just clicked buy right then and there, thinking I had just bought the game. And it was the Xbox 360 dashboard theme. And so, like, for the rest of the time he had that console, which this
Still
was
go.
after the PS4 already came out and all that.
Hmm.
For the rest of the time he had that console, he had the Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 dashboard theme with Ron Weasley, like, staring up at you, mouth
I
agape.
think he still has that as the wallpaper because he still uses that 360.
Remember that time we got together and we played Snake Eater?
I I was not I was only there for half a Snake Eater. I think I missed a lot of the memorable hijinks, but I was there for every other Metal Gear, including, and this is one of my like those memories where I think back and I'm like, what? How did we function as people? And it was playing Metal Gear 2 as a multiplayer communal experience.
Oh,
And
baby.
we were like determined every time we played one of those games. It wasn't like let's play a little today and then a little next week. It was no, we're gonna finish this game.
It was
We're
like
gonna
two
see it
sittings at
through
most.
at most. But Metal Gear 2 and MSX game, we were like, no, no, we are going to power through. And it was, I swear, it must have
It
been
was
2 or 3
brutal.
in the morning. And I remember laying on my bed. It was in my house, my parents' house, and my bed was in the room. I remember laying on the bed and like that tired feeling where you can't keep your eyes open and you're just like trying so hard, but every few seconds you fall asleep and then you wake up startled, like, whoa, what happened? And then I remember one time I woke up and it was many hours had passed. You all had left, and I woke up and all that was there with me was you all had placed a pizza box next to me in my bed, and I woke up with my arm draped around this Domino's pizza box, so perplexed about the evening that had just transpired. Oh.
Yeah, I guess you missed out on part one of MGS3 where we actually ordered a Domino's pizza, and again, we were very intoxicated. Our buddy, and he was like, "What do you want on the pizza?" Right? Because he had his laptop with him, and I was like, "Give it here, I'll fill out the pizza form," and I marked like triple extra on every kind of cheese they had. And I still remember the pizza guy's face when he delivered that beast. Because, my apartment at the time, this was when we were in undergrad. My apartment that I was living in, you have to go up like this spooky staircase. Do you remember that?
I remember your neighbors, they had like a sign on their door.
Yeah. And he, like, when I opened that door and he like gingerly passed me this soggy, greasy pizza box, he looked like he'd just seen a ghost. Like he had no idea someone could actually eat this shit. But we finished that whole pizza, and I think we played all the way. We got that pizza like almost as soon as we started playing, and we played all the way up to, I want to say, the end or the fear, whichever one comes last. So I remember,
I don't, yeah, I think you probably did because I think I only checked in at the tail end. Yeah,
but
so you stopped after the end. You
yeah, yeah,
stopped
yeah,
after
yeah,
you ate his parrot.
yeah, yeah. That was the most unorthodox way of killing the end, like in retrospect, because I had never played that game. Obviously you're supposed to like use the sound scope to find him and then snipe him back, right, before he snipes you.
Mm-hmm.
But
It's supposed to
I
be a very epic
remember
encounter.
I had like whipped out the assault rifle and gunned down his bird, and you can pick it up, and of course if you can pick up meat in MGS3 you can eat it. So I like ran into the clearing with his bird and ate it right in front of him where I knew he could see me, and he got so pissed. He's like, "My bird!" And I remember, our buddy being like totally shocked that I would do something like that on my first playthrough and just totally ruin the atmosphere. That and waiting till the end, fell asleep and covering him in C4 and beating the game that way. Or when we got to the fear and just whipping out, I think it's like the AK in that game,
Yeah,
whatever the assault
I
rifle is.
remember that. You whipped out the assault rifle and you just
Just
murked the
like gunned
guy.
him down with no recourse, just stun locked him.
Yeah, you did not play the canonical run of Metal Gear Solid 3.
And then, of course, we've played Mario Party together countless times.
Yes, I was thinking about, and we actually mentioned this a few nights ago, was the most memorable Mario Party game for me personally was at my brother at Derek's bachelor party,
Yep,
which what bachelor parties end up being. But of
yep.
course, for Derek, it was we were all in a loft and we just hung out and played games all day. And at some point, it was the big night, the long day that we were there, and everybody, especially you and him, had partaken in some alcohol quite a bit, I
Yeah.
would say, to the point where Derek was asking strangers whether they preferred Pokemon or Digimon.
Yeah.
I'm always the boring dad figure, even before I was a dad.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was mostly sober, just kind of hanging out. And our other buddy was also vaguely sober. He was trying to find a pizza that would deliver at 3 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
And we were like, hey, I brought the 64. Let's play some Mario Party.
Old time's
But
sake.
you were in no condition to play Mario Party. Derek was in no condition to play Mario Party. I was in peak condition to play Mario Party, aside from being very tired. But it's what I imagine the Olympics would be like if you put, say, a great track runner, say your Usain Bolt,
Yeah.
against like just some slob you picked up at the McDonald's. Like it was you and Derek, and you were like passing out every turn,
Yeah.
and I'd have to nudge you just to roll the dice. And Derek was just like delirious. And I remember winning the game by like some ridiculous margin of 3 or 4 or 5 stars, and just thinking like this is like the biggest cakewalk of my entire life. Like this isn't a fair competition. These aren't these. I feel like I should feel bad for winning so dominantly. Like this isn't a fair fight.
Yeah, I remember when you guys woke me up when the game was over and thinking like, it's over already? Like it's gotta be like turn three.
Oh, and at this point, I was so fed up with everybody's antics. I was just like, "Yeah, go to bed. Oh, go to bed." The sober, boring dad has to get
Yeah,
on with his
lay
evening.
down the law.
Oh yes, has always been my role, for better and for worse.
So speaking of you laying down the law, do we want to talk about you're out?
Oh my gosh, I don't know how that didn't occur to me, because there was a good period of time in the my early college years and your late high school, early college years where we were playing a lot of Nintendo 64 games.
Yeah.
We were really, my friend and I played a lot of WWF No Mercy, and we had our own little fictional leagues and such, and we played that a lot. But then we also really got into NFL Blitz, and I would create this yearly tournament, and we made it a big to do. And we had all of our friends entered in, and we played the day of the Super Bowl or the day of uh, wrestling's Royal Rumble. It was some reason
So
we would all be gathered.
yeah, here's
And
an addendum that
mhm.
we're about to discuss. This was the first one I had attended. You guys
Oh right,
finally
yes,
talked me into it
right.
because I
And
don't care about football.
well, no, and it was something where another friend of ours who wasn't interested, just he couldn't make it. He flaked out at the last minute. And so we were like, well, I don't think Setzer really likes football or has ever played this game, but let's see if he'll play because you seemed game to do whatever, and you were. And so at the time, my younger brother, like I said, is about 8 years younger. He was probably
He was
probably
probably like
eight,
10.
9. He was
Yeah,
young.
he was
He
younger
was
than
young.
10.
He was young, old enough not to do this, but still young. And Derek and him got matched up.
Well, wait. Before we get to that match, I need to
Mm.
come clean.
Hmm.
So I was actually your little brother's first match,
Yes.
and our other buddy in his big brother was also participating,
Yes.
and he pulled me aside, and he goes, "Okay, here's what you're gonna do. There's a play in here called the hook. Use
A
it
duh hook.
every single time.
Hmm.
Do not do anything but the hook, and I guarantee you will win."
Hmm.
So I dutifully used the hook again and again and again, and I could like see the frustration building on your little brother's face, and I could see like he was just starting to seethe over there. And I don't remember how he pulled out.
I think we ran interference at some point
Yeah,
and said we
yeah,
need to stop this.
yeah. Stop using the hook. But
Yeah.
then, of course, Derek was your little brother's next match.
Right, and he was, Derek's very competitive, like I said before,
Yeah,
and he was not going to go easy on our little brother. He wanted to win the
the
Blitz
Rumble.
Bowl trophy, as it were, which
Yeah,
was a little Charles Barkley figure I got off of Amazon, and I slapped a football helmet on. And he really wanted it, and so he was just taking it to our little brother, and he was putting up with it. I mean, he was not happy for sure,
he was
but
seething. He was visibly
oh no,
seething.
he
I
was
remember him
angry,
sitting on
but
your bed.
he was still stable, but he
Yeah,
was seething.
yeah.
And what really put him over, because you have to understand, when you grow up in a household, especially with brothers, sometimes those competitive moments become more than just the game. I can remember sometimes taking a PS2 controller and hitting Derek in the arm with the little blunt edge of it in anger over what he would do in games because it was just like it was so personal what he would do. And he had a commanding lead. He scored a touchdown, and for whatever godforsaken reason, he decided to go for an extra point.
So it looks like I'll be wrapping this story up thanks to some technical difficulties on Chesten's end. But where we last left our hero, Derek goes in to score an extra point. Whatever reason, he's just possessed. He has to rub it in. He has to humiliate his little brother. And this drives him over the edge. He can't take it. He erupts. He explodes. He's like freaking out, throwing a full-on tantrum, throwing his fists, kicking his feet, screaming, crying, and of course the rest of us, guys, we're just like sitting there trying not to laugh, trying not to look over at what's happening, just trying not to egg him on. But it's pretty apparent that, you know, we know. So Chesten, at his absolute limit, you know, so I look over at Chesten, beet red. He picks up his little brother under his armpits like a baby. And the whole time, he's just like kicking and flailing and trying desperately to hit Derek any way he can. And he just picks him up, drags him out of the room, drags him back across the hall to his own bedroom, walks back into the room with the rest of us, shuts the door behind him, sits down on the bed, and says, "Alright, who's next?" And that's that. That was the Royal Rumble.
Whose darkness has silenced through the night. What a thrill. I'm searching an mail into you. What a fear in my heart. But you're so supreme.